Hello, this is Falling from Team Liquid, and this is about spells and their impact on the viewing experience, and also to do with smart casting. Now, one thing I had been talking about in some of my other videos is the there's a lot less units that have been designed that make it for microbility, and with that burst shot and the easy attack retreat sort of micro. And so there's a lot less of this sort of stuff. If we sort of move in here to pick off stuff. And then people end up complaining that Starcraft 2 has become more an A move sort of game, and there's a lot of things that are boring. In compensation, what Blizzard has done is added in a lot of spells. And but there's a bit of a problem with that, is that there's only so many spells I think that you can add in a game and before things start getting a lot more confusing. Similar to why people find World of Warcraft spell fights so like, well, what's going on? There's just so much stuff happening. Or a team fight in MOBA. If you really know what's going on, you can kind of tell, but and part of the thing is, if we look at this sort of spell here, as soon as you throw in a spell, spells are good, they're interesting, but you're adding in extra information onto the screen. There's your units, and now you have extra information. Compared to when you're moving these, all you have is the unit moving back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so an example of sort of abilities that work quite well in Starcraft 2 is something like the Stalker, and it's really easy to tell what's going on when you're microing stalkers because you got the blink, and there's not that much additional information that's added onto the screen. There's just a little bit of that blue stuff there. Similarly, we have something like Marines, and they move really fast, and we've got our it's easy to tell when you got the stim going down, and then you got these sort of attack, retreat, and if I needed to split, you can tell what that's going on, and then you see the big explosion and all the damage that happens, and there's not that much additional information on the screen, so it's really easy to tell what's going on. Attack, retreat, that sort of stuff. And so my contention is that we could probably have, for every 10 of these sorts of attack retreat, you could also have the, where's my Hydralisks? Hydralisks, because they were faster in Brood War, had this nice little attack retreat that they could do as well. And compared to, I think we get diminishing returns for the amount of spells that we end up having on the screen. And just to kind of give you an example of what I mean, I'm going to use some Brood War examples because I feel a lot of people kind of get tired of StarCraft 2 being used as the non-example of things that are bad. And just kind of show you how things could be a lot more confusing in Brood War than they were. And so part of the thing that kept things simple, there's spells in the game, but something like Zerg really only had 2 spells that added information to the game that were used on a regular basis. So one you had was Plague, and so that was a splash damage, red for damage, and you'd see it does continuing damage for quite some time. And the other one you would see is Dark Swarm and Orange Cloud, and so orange dust cloud, go underneath, and you're safe, red damage. Pretty simple stuff. But there's a lot of abilities that are also in the game that could have been seen on a more regular basis that would have actually been a detriment to the scene or to the spectator experience if they were there for any regular period of time. So you have Ensnare, which is green goop that slows things down. That's a pretty obvious sort of ability. It's not bad, but when you sort of combine it with everything else, it starts getting a bit more confusing. And then this isn't a spell at all, but there is another thing that was an attack that did this sort of purple goop that starts getting on ships and stuff. And this is where things really start getting bad. Is that you have this purple, and this attack is not nearly so obvious So red damage, orange, you're safe underneath. Purple is if I attack with something like a Mutalisk, it does additional damage for all the spores that it has underneath. So you have purple on some ships, we have green on some more, and then maybe we throw in a plague. So green, purple, red, and then if we start throwing in dark swarms into the mix, this starts getting really confusing exactly what's going on. There's just so much additional information. This would be compounded if we had smart casting, where it's very easy to throw down a ton of orange dust clouds, get tons of purple stuff in here, red, green, whatever. You know, not every game's going to have equal amounts, but there's just a tendency to have more information, which is going to add clutter to the screen. Similarly, I didn't get the stuff down in preparation. You had the same sort of thing with Protoss, that although there's a lot of different spellcasters, most of the micro was just through the attack retreat. It doesn't add additional clutter. The sort of spells that did add information onto the screen, there's only two that were used with any frequency. One was Stasis, and so that freezes units, and then the other was Storm, and so that did a fair amount of damage, especially if they stayed underneath it, and it did a ton of damage. So it was quite obvious what was going on. It wasn't a buff, debuff. It would actually destroy units quite easily. So freeze and storm. But it could have been a lot, and that's pretty simple stuff to keep track of. It could have been a lot more cluttered, though, had all the spells worked out that Blizzard had prepared. So for instance, we had those two, but there's also this Maelstrom that's used on occasion. That's pretty easy to kind of tell what's going on. It's freezing. But then we start throwing in these disruptor things. And then perhaps we have stasis. And then we start throwing in storms. And then you can kind of start seeing why this would start getting to be kind of a confusing situation when you see all these sort of stuff going down. And it ends up making for a very cluttered screen. Because it was so rare that happened, it was just sort of like, cool, Disruption Web is finally used, or Maelstrom, awesome, it's used, because it was so rare. But if on to make units more interesting, or abilities more interesting, we're just adding spells to absolutely every unit. You're having more and more of these sorts of spells on the screen that just adds to the clutter. And so, for instance, in Starcraft 2, if we're going to go there, we run into a bit of a problem, in my opinion. Especially with these sort of bubble spells. More so now than before. So on one hand, what we have is the Phoenix. It's got the bubble going on. That's kind of an obvious sort of ability. But then we've got more and more spells. So we've got our force fields, and that's well and good. And then we have Guardian Shield, right? But now we've got this time warp thing going on here. So now we're starting to get even more of these bubbles, and theoretically we could get that sort of thing going on there. And what it adds to is it no longer becomes extremely obvious on what's happening, because you have very similar looking spells like Time Warp versus Guardian Shield. Bubbles and bubbles, bubbles within bubbles, and then very similar looking spell. Now you might not see these sorts of spells every single time in the amount of energy, but you see the sort of similarity in the amount of information that we're adding onto the screen that just ends up being kind of cluttered, even if we're not using it all the time. But with smart casting, you're going to see a lot more of these abilities all at once, compared to if it was balanced around the idea of that it's not. And then, oh, we forgot to throw in these guys, but you also have, including to the mix, storms. You even notice storms are a lot more cluttered than the Brood War equivalent. You can usually see what's going on underneath the spells. It's a pretty clear spell as far as clutter is concerned. And compared to where we are at here, there's a lot more information on there. But probably the worst what's going on right now as far as sort of diminishing returns for spells that we're getting is the Zerg. And because what you have with the Zerg is, so I said that purple spore stuff wasn't the best sort of ability. But we have an even worse version of that, which is corruption. It was considered to be a boring unit, so what they added in was this sort of spell that adds green stuff. And that, from a spectator's point of view, very hard to tell what's going on. Number one, it's very difficult to see that something has corruption. And compared to the other green spells that we have. So we have green spells that are fungal, you know, to freeze everything. And then we have these new spells that are also green. Now, I don't know if this is just the unit editor that makes it so hard to see, but this is not a very... Maybe it's just beta, because that's hard to see what's going on. So with... You know, you got your what are they called? Infested Terran that can be thrown down. But I would argue that corruption is probably one of the boringest spells of them all. Or if not boring, it's not a spectator-friendly one. You can't corruption. It does additional damage, but it doesn't show up very well. And this also does damage. So what's the difference between one and the other? With smart casting, it just ends up with tons of spells on the screen, and yeah, I think I'll stop there. But just to sort of sum up, I understand the reason for adding more spells is to make units more interesting, but adding more functionality to micro-ability so that you have this sort of attack retreat like that, you can add way more of these sorts of micro tricks into the game and not have it additionally confusing, because attack retreat, attack retreat, attack retreat, it's just the unit moving back and forth, no additional clutter. As soon as you start throwing down spells, you start getting a lot more things, a lot more confusing on exactly just what's going on here. We got green, red, orange, and this even has the advantage of being multicolored at least. So red, green, orange, big obvious differences compared to green, green, green with the Starcraft 2 Zerg spells have. So I think I'll just finish there. So falling out.